And so here we are. We're moving into Friday of the first week of this 2-week marathon. How you doing? I hope you're well. I hope you're having a good day. In this session, we will move on to look at the Office of Vocation, its structure, and the way in which discipline functions in the United Church of Canada. Now, the Office of Vocation is one truly new aspect of the structure for which we have no prior experience. In the previous structure of the church, the different aspects of the candidacy process, of oversight and discipline, were divided between presbytery and conference. There's no question that the structure led to a certain amount of duplication, and it did not always result in addressing issues properly. The Office of Vocation is an effort to address these challenges. And because of its wide-ranging authority, it's really important that we understand it. Section J.2.1, Compliance. Ministry personnel are responsible for recognizing the authority of the denomination and fulfilling all their obligations to it as required by the Office of Vocation. Let me repeat that. Ministry personnel are responsible for recognizing the authority of the denomination and fulfilling all of their obligations to it as required by the Office of Vocation. That's a phrase that replaces the previous promise of clergy to submit to the discipline of presbytery. And that was a promise made at every covenanting, every installation of a minister. What is the Office of Vocation? Well, it's overseen by the Board of Vocation, which is an elected body of lay and ministry personnel, as nominated by the General Council Nominating Committee. The primary task of the Office of Vocation is maintaining the roll, R-O-L-L, of those deemed to be accredited United Church ministers. In other words, maintaining the list of those who are accredited to be United Church ministers, which sounds like a fairly mundane task, but actually has a whole lot of stuff going on there. That includes noting the status of any individual, keeping records of various special notes, for example, supervisory training, inter-ministry training, and so on. And that's a wide-ranging assignment, and it's accomplished through Office of Vocation ministers who are deployed regionally, and several different committees and boards, such as the Candidacy Board, the Accreditation Board, the Response Committee, and so on. So in each of the clusters of regions, there is an Office of Vocation Minister. The Office of Vocation Minister is located regionally, but is an employee, if you like, of the central body, the Office of Vocation. And then there are the boards and committees, and I just want to run through these quickly to give you a sense of the scope and to answer any queries you might have. Standards for Accreditation Board. This body sets standards for recognition for various streams of ministry. Continuing education. Right now, each ministry personnel receives 3 weeks of continuing education time per year, but there is no control over whether or how those weeks are used. In time, this board may move to make that more rigorous. The board also oversees the mandatory workshops required of ministry personnel and others. There is a credentialing committee. Individuals who are seeking to enter United Church of Canada ministry from another tradition. Those who are seeking to move within the order of ministry, in other words, from diaconal ministry to ordained ministry. Those seeking recognition as intentional interim ministers, educational supervisors, military, and other sorts of chaplains will all deal with the credentialing committee. It's important when we talk about oversight to recognize that oversight includes both ministry personnel and communities of faith. The first is done by the Office of Vocation, the other by the region, but they are often in touch with one another, and they certainly connect with one another at different stages along the way. There is a response committee that deals with complaints when raised, and we'll get to that in a moment. They ensure that there are trained and supported reviewers, investigators, consultants, conflict resolution facilitators, and people with other expertise as required for the work of the church. The response committee is responsible for receiving and assessing concerns and determining the most appropriate process or committee to address eligible concerns. There is a remedial committee which is responsible for the compliance piece that I mentioned a moment ago. When there are allegations of misconduct or ineffectiveness, this group receives the investigation reports and decides on actions. It decides what to do next. Will there be a warning, a reprimand, a formal hearing, and so on? There is an accessibility assessment committee. This group determines if a ministry personnel has been or is incapacitated and the extent of that incapacity. They support the ministry personnel's rehabilitation where appropriate. They oversee the restorative care plan service providers, the appropriate regional council ministers, and the Office of Vocation Minister. There are formal hearing committees and an appeal committee. Each is comprised of 3 elected members of the Board of Vocation. Lots of stuff going on. And that, of course, doesn't even take into account the candidacy board with which many of you are intimately familiar. When the various committees receive a report and make a decision about an action, that decision can be appealed. That's the Appeals Committee, Section J.10.2. Section J.10.3, and I invite you to turn now there. The Formal Hearing Committee has the responsibility for conducting formal hearing committees to consider formal complaints and recommendations brought forward by the remedial committee. Well, here's the process. The response committee considers concerns raised regarding misconduct, effectiveness, or incapacity of ministry personnel that can be raised by a variety of different sources. Please note that none of this applies to candidates. All concerns regarding candidates go to the candidacy board. Investigations into concerns will be dealt with by the response committee, but it is the candidacy board that is responsible for making decisions in response to the investigator's report. So, in step 1, the response committee receives a concern and has to decide whether to consider it or not. And it doesn't consider it if the last incident of conduct or action giving rise to the concern was more than 12 months ago, with the exception of concerns relating to sexual abuse and or sexual misconduct. The United Church takes such concerns of sexual abuse or sexual misconduct with great seriousness, and there is an entire section of the manual and an entire process in the manual given over to responding to such concerns. The response committee does not consider the concern if it does not constitute misconduct, ineffectiveness, or incapacity in the part of a minister. So, for example, if somebody is concerned about the length of my hair or the fact that my beard hasn't been trimmed since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic or whatever, it won't be considered. And also if the concern is frivolous, vexatious, manifestly without substance, or made for an improper purpose. So there are any number of reasons why somebody might get annoyed about a minister. Some of those things are important. Some of those things can be dealt with. Others, you can't do anything about. I'm the height that I am. I had once had somebody say to me, your sermon would be much more effective if you had a deeper voice. Thanks for the feedback. There's not much that can be done, but if that was taken as a complaint, it would not be dealt with. So in other words, what's being said here is that complaints, concerns have to have a serious nature. They just can't be an annoyance for the individual involved. What does the response committee do in deciding whether there is a case to be made? Well, it's looking at whether or not it reveals the complaint reveals facts that, even if true, constitute misconduct, ineffectiveness, or incapacity on the part of the ministry personnel. I mean, does this really have to do with the functioning of an individual in ministry? The party raising the concern will be offered opportunity to provide additional information, failing which the concern will not be considered. So someone can't simply drop a bomb in the middle of the response committee and then not say anything more about it. I could tell you more information, but I won't. That doesn't fly. If you want to make a complaint, if you want to raise a concern, you need to be able to substantiate it and stand behind it. As soon as reasonably possible after receiving a concern, the response committee will provide the complainant with confirmation that the concern was received. In other words, we got your concern and we're looking at it. Notify the ministry personnel that a concern regarding their conduct or actions was made, and provide the ministry personnel with a copy of the concern or a summary of the concern raised. Ensure that pastoral care is offered to the ministry personnel and other affected people, and refer the concern to a consultant, the regional council minister, the office of vocation minister, whatever seems to be the best place to send the concern to be appropriately addressed. Step 3, if it turns out to be an eligible concern, then the response committee sends it to some place for action, again, depending on the content. It may be a matter of an accessibility assessment. And accessibility we often associate with physical limitations, but this is not just physical. It could be any number of things which may be impacting the effectiveness of the ministry personnel. The matter could be referred to a conflict resolution facilitator, provided that both parties are agreeable. It could be a reviewer or an investigator, and reviewers and investigators operate at different levels of seriousness and complexity, depending on the nature of the concern that's raised. So this is all done. The committee gets reports back and with evidence and finding of facts. And it may very well be that the ministry personnel has fulfilled the functions of ministry in an effective way, and so no further action is needed. The ministry personnel has not fulfilled the functions of ministry in an effective way, and these are the things that can be done to assist them. There are reasonable and probable grounds for believing that the ministry personnel has acted in a way that is a proper ground for discipline. So you see what's happening here. First of all, concerns are being validated and assessed for whether or not they really do apply, they really are relevant. And then they're being assessed on the basis of fact. Are there facts involved in this case? Can we demonstrate that what is being alleged is in fact occurring, or did in fact occur? There are steps taken, if it is a matter of accessibility, to see how those can be remedied to assist the minister in performing their duties in an acceptable fashion. If they haven't fulfilled ministry function in an effective way, maybe we can work with them. Maybe there's other training, maybe there's counseling, maybe who knows. But the aim there is to make sure that ministry personnel is returned to as full as possible effective service in the call of God and the church. And only finally, if there are reasonable and probable grounds for believing that a minister has acted in an inappropriate fashion, acted in a way that is a proper ground of discipline, do we move that forward to a formal hearing. The report and opinion of the reviewer or investigator can be accepted or rejected. The committee can send the matter back to the reviewer or investigator with other questions that may require the investigator engage in further inquiry and provide a supplemental report. I've been in situations where we have received a report where, because of our perspective, and this I'm now talking about a presbytery committee that engaged a reviewer. From our perspective, the reviewer missed a whole chunk of the story, and we've asked the reviewer to go back and investigate that and incorporate that new information into their report. So it's possible for this to go on, unfortunately, for some time. This is not a quick process, which is very painful when you're in the midst of it. But it's also reassuring that the church is very careful about this. It tries not to rush to judgment. So what happens next? Well, let's assume that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the ministry personnel has not fulfilled the functions of clergy in an effective manner, has engaged in misconduct, or there is reasonable and probable grounds for believing that the ministry personnel has in some way acted in a way that is proper ground for discipline. So, not fulfilling the role of ministry in an effective manner, engaged in misconduct, or reasonable probable ground for believing that, in fact, the person has done something which is a proper ground for discipline, then the remedial committee has to decide what to do with the concern. And the remedial committee will consider a variety of factors. First of all, have there been any other concerns? And remember, we're talking about concerns that are raised to the level of being dealt with, not just vexatious concerns. So are there other concerns about this ministry personnel, and how have they been dealt with? Because sometimes there's a pattern of ineffectiveness. Are there other decisions on record regarding this ministry personnel? Is there any report by the effectiveness support, ways that people, committees, organizations have attempted to work with the ministry personnel to increase their effectiveness? Has anything ever arisen under the sexual misconduct prevention and response policy? Are there any other sources of information, relevant, reliable information that relates to a ministry personnel, including information from the appropriate regional council and the submissions of the ministry personnel themselves? So that's taken very seriously as well. Assuming that we are the subject of the investigation, what we might have to say about the concern. That's all taken into account. Having taken all of that into account, the remedial committee will declare that the ministry personnel status is not in good standing. The ministry personnel will be suspended, and that the matter will be referred to one of two places. The first is a referral to effectiveness support to develop a directed plan. Now that can be a plan of skill development, it can be counseling, it can be any number of things which, through the investigation process, it's been identified that this ministry personnel needs assistance with. or the remedial committee can bring it forward as a formal complaint to the formal complaint committee with a recommendation for a disciplinary sanction, including that the ministry personnel's name be removed from the register of accredited ministry personnel and placed on the discontinued service list in disciplinary, which is the closest thing we have in the United Church to what the Roman Catholics might call defrocking. Now, provided that the ministry personnel is actively engaged and fully compliant with the directive program brought about by the Effectiveness Support Committee, the Office of Vocation will provide the ministry personnel with their standard remuneration while they're engaged in a directive program. In other words, if we willingly participate in the remedial program, which is brought about for our good, then we receive our regular levels of pay. The Effectiveness Support Committee may recommend back that the ministry personnel has successfully completed a directive program. They did what they were asked to do. They've done it successfully. And if the remedial committee accepts the recommendation, the ministry personnel is returned to good standing, and everybody's advised of that. And hopefully, and in the vast majority of cases, I have to say, where this has happened, either under the previous structure or in the current structure, what happens is that somebody learns from the experience. They acquire a whole new set of ways of looking at the world, or a new set of tools, or a deeper insight to themselves, and they go on to be, if not more effective, just better as ministry personnel. I mean, seriously, if somebody wanted to fund a series of programs to upgrade my effectiveness, I'd be wanting to be helpful, even if a complaint might be deeply wounding. But if the Effectiveness Support Committee advises the remedial committee that the ministry personnel has refused to submit or has not successfully committed to completing the program, then it can be moved to a Board of Vocation to establish a formal hearing committee. There have been people, I've been part of situations where there has been a refusal to submit to the authority of the church, or they have not successfully completed a program, and so they don't want to participate in their own training and improvement, and so we need to move on to the next step. None of these decisions are taken easily. So a decision of a formal hearing committee, which can be taken to an appeal committee. This is a legal thing. This is getting lawyers involved. This is the church acting as a law court, which is one of the reasons why the Office of Vocation has such an appeal, if that's the right word. We had formal hearings under the previous structure, but the makeup of the formal hearings was always provided by folk who were the individual's peers in conference or in presbytery, not necessarily trained as lawyers. I've sat on formal committees. I make no claim to be a lawyer. And so we would mix the legal and the pastoral functions to the detriment of both. So here's what happens. If a formal complaint has been proven, the formal hearing committee has to decide. They have to decide on what is going to happen in response. That could include one or more of remedial work, restitution, which could be financial or some other restitution to the complainant, an admonition, in other words, in private, you as ministry personnel are reprimanded, a rebuke. This is a public taking to task of the individual. It's more serious. It goes on your file. I'm not quite sure how it would take place. I've never seen one done, but I'm sure there are ways of making it happen. Suspension. You can be suspended from functioning as ministry personnel for a period of time, or permanently removed from an office that you hold, or placed on the discontinued service list, disciplinary, which means that you would have great difficulty returning to active service. You can be expelled. You can have your membership in the United Church of Canada removed. So this is serious stuff. This is big business, folks. The candidacy board is one that you are more familiar with, and which is often covered in some detail in your programs. It oversees and directs the entire process from the first expression of interest in becoming a minister right through to the point where a person is recommended to the region for accreditation. That's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of stuff that we don't particularly like to hear about, and most folk, the overwhelming majority of clergy, will go the length of their time in ministry without being involved in anything to do with the Board of Vocation in a serious fashion after you've completed your candidacy board stuff. However, if you are involved with the Office of Vocation for a disciplinary purpose, you need to know your rights and your responsibilities, and I've posted to the Brightspace page a couple of resources that have been prepared for the Association of Ministers in Region 15 that may be of helpful reference to you. I don't want to scare you. As I said, vast majority of ministry personnel never have anything to do with the disciplinary processes of the church. But they are there, and it's important to know about them, and important to know how they are there, not just for control and for punishment, but also to help ministers be the best that God has called them to be. Thanks very much, and I look forward to our conversation, and I want to take the opportunity to wish you a very, very good weekend. God bless you.